welcome to everyone who is with us today. We're discussing the state of Poland after election, after actually a long election cycle. We have a great guest speaker with us today, discussant. So we'll spend a very informative and enjoyable 1 hour together. Well, let's get on with it, and we begin. Good morning, everyone across the Atlantic. Good afternoon here in Europe. This is the Visegrad Insight breakfast, one of a series that we organize at Visegrad Insight, the Respublika Foundation. You can see in the back, we're in the office today. This is a series of meetings between diplomats, experts, and journalists mostly from the region, but as our slogan goes, on Central Europe, from Central Europe, we have also a number of participants who are from other parts of the world, and they're interested in, for good reasons, in the region. Today we're discussing a situation after election in Poland. Specifically, we're going to look into the political sociology, into the understanding of the Polish voters and what Poland is, how divided and in what way divided Poland might be. We have today with us Ben Stanley, professor at SWPS, Szkoła Wyższa Psychologii Społecznej, private university in Poland, and affiliate professor at the Sussex University, specialist who specializes in political sociology, especially the metrics, demography, geography of electoral distribution, votes and voters' preference, and populism, the question of populism. I'm sure he'll tell you more about it when he speaks and refers to him. For everyone, rules of engagement in this discussion are quite simple. So we mute microphones for everyone who is not speaking. We record the first part. This first half an hour, say 25 minutes, is on the record when mostly me and Ben discuss. And just to make it more comfortable with everyone, we turn off the recording. We use the first part of the recording later for social media, but we are turning off the recording later to have an informal chat, as we otherwise have in the office when we invite a more smaller group of Warsaw-based guests and discuss it over coffee in an informal manner. At any point in time, do ask questions or shoot comments through the chat box, but also when you want to speak, raise your hand, raise your virtual hand through the toolbox that is offered by Zoom, and I'll be pointing, I'll be giving you the floor to engage in discussion. Let's begin now with the state of where Poland is after election. I have a few points to raise, and first of all, I think we must acknowledge there was an amazing run from Rafał Trzaskowski, who started very late, and he came closer than 500,000 votes, a result that to many is disappointing, but at the same time, in a very uneven game, in a very uneven race and political circumstance, where the government was all employed in helping the re-election of the incumbent president. This is an amazing result, and what Poland definitely remains after that election is mobilized and is showing with 10 million votes that could be treated as a referendum, saying a big no to one-side party domination of PIS. We'll see how much that can be influential, this voice of the opposition, how much that can be influential. If we look into the statistic that Ben will, I'm sure, discuss, I think it highlights also that the PIS government cannot be fully satisfied and completely happy. It is a turning point for Poland. to a large extent, it allows PIS to fulfill its dreams of capturing media, capturing the judiciary, a potential assault on autonomy of local governance or NGOs. But there are big question marks if that really makes sense in the longer run, in this 3 years run ahead of the next vote, and what will it mean if they actually go the hard way. It also, the result of the election is very unfortunate for the place of Poland in the world, from the point of view of the position that Poland finds itself after that election, partly because of the narrative and the rhetoric used in the game. We will see even less friends or friendly faces. Poland will need to earn a lot of credit before what was said in the campaign and what was voted for, including bigotry, homophobia, and conspiracy theories, are forgiven by our partners in NATO and EU. And importantly, we have seen Andrzej Duda meeting with President Donald Trump in the middle of the race with no clear purpose but to seek endorsement from his powerful ally. But at the same time, as we all observe the press, the trend is not to the advantage of Donald Trump, and we might see actually a replacement of the U.S. administration, and more importantly, changes in the legislative in the U.S., changes in Senate potentially to the advantage of Democrats, who are not so permissive when it comes to the elements of PIS strategy. So all of that seems to be very, very interesting. One other aspect, perhaps less discussed currently, apart from the victory of Andrzej Duda and the loss of his main challenger, is the future of the far right in Poland, but also, I would hint, the future of the left. While it has been marginalized in the case of Robert Biedroń, representing official left, Szymon Hołownia came to the picture, and in many ways he captured the emotions and the slogans that are typically, you would say, leftist. All of that to be discussed later in the general discussion. But now I will ask and give the floor to Ben Stanley with a couple of questions. Maybe we begin with what do we know about the voters who voted, and where do they come from? And is Poland as divided as they say between A and B? Ben?
Okay, thanks. If you just bear with me for a moment while I get these slides up. They should be visible now. So after every election in Poland, I tend to hear, whether among sort of casual commenters or particularly in the overseas media, two things. One is an exaggeration of the distance between the victor and the defeated. It's always, Polish elections always seem to be portrayed as an all or nothing affair. The other is the notion that Poland is in some way insuperably divided into two camps, one represented by peace, of course, the other represented by various opposition forces. These cliches, stereotypes and ideas have some degree of truth in them, but to a large extent they're an exaggeration. Anyone who went on social media on the evening of the election, the second round of the election, will probably have seen this map pop up. The zombie map of voivodeships. I call this a zombie map of voivodeships because it's the map that refuses to die. It's based on the notion that Poland should be seen as divided between East and West. Sometimes the former lines of partition are drawn on to suggest that there is almost like a physical border between peace territory in the East and opposition territory in the West. The problem with this is that it, first of all, it exaggerates the extent of these geographical differences, as I'll show you in a moment. It also underplays the extent to which there is actually spread of support across Poland as a whole for the main candidates in any election. This problem emerges not only in presidential elections, although those elections do tend to polarize the picture here, but also we see this again with responses to voting behavior in the parliamentary election last year, in the Euro elections before that, and in pretty much every election since 2005. So if we actually look at a more fine-grained regional distribution of votes, we can see that, yes, indeed, Andrzej Duda won more convincingly in many of the counties of eastern and southern Poland, in the southeast in particular. These are his top 10 counties in which he won. We could go down to a more finer grained analysis and look at this at the level of communes, but this gives more of the picture than this crude divide does. So we can see that Andrzej Duda may not have picked up as much support in the west of Poland, but nevertheless, the idea that there is this strong concentration of his vote in that region is somewhat overstated. If we look at Trzaskowski, we can see that, again, obviously the opposite picture emerges. We have a clear concentration of votes for Trzaskowski, particularly in urban parts of Western and Northern Poland, which is something that I'll get to shortly. But again, there are areas of support in particular parts of Eastern Southern Europe that Poland that have their own specific characteristics. And this sense that Trzaskowski's vote is limited to the West is over-exaggerated. We can see this when we look at the county level difference in vote share. This, I would argue, is the map that we need to look at if we want to understand what's happening in Poland. There is a concentration of support for Duda in those voivodeships, but it's highly differentiated. It's differentiated between urban and rural areas. And we also find that Duda has made some significant incursions into what used to be seen as this Polska, this territory that was exclusively the preserve of Civic Platform and their candidates. We can also see that there are many areas, in both halves of Poland, where the differences between these two candidates are not particularly significant in terms of their support. Dividing this up in terms of one stark orange color on one side and one stark blue color on the other side exaggerates the extent to which there are genuine differences at the regional level. And this image gives a false impression of the extent to which Poland is divided. I would argue that Poland is differentiated. It's not divided. It's differentiated in ways which we see in many other countries, in many other political circumstances where we look at political geography. But what it isn't is fundamentally divided in geographical terms. If we look at turnout patterns, we can also see that the idea that Duda was overwhelmingly favored by increases in turnout, these are levels of increase in turnout compared with the first round, is also somewhat overstated. So higher turnout has been in evidence, both in general terms in these two elections compared with prior elections, and also in the second round election compared to the first round. We can see this to a greater extent in rural and small town communes. This is at the commune level now. Whereas we see smaller increases in cities, and this is of relevance to the overall picture. If we look at the size of these communes, those areas where the population is up to 5,000 gained the most in between these two, in between the first and the second round. We see a more significant increase over time between these two elections in areas where we would expect Andrzej Duda to be doing somewhat better. This is one of the reasons that we can conclude that it has had an effect on the overall result. If we look at large cities and urban areas in general, we find that that increase was either smaller or indeed there was a decrease, something of a demobilization between the first round election and the second round of the election. So there is some differentiation on a regional basis, but the picture is not a a stark distinction between two halves of Poland that are completely separate from each other, and are and where one side is unable to make gains at the expense of the other. That to say that is to hugely exaggerate the situation. The attempt was made to try to increase support for Andrzej Duda by inviting communes with populations, this should be less than 20,000 rather than more than 20,000, to compete for a new fire engine for their locality. We don't actually find any effect of this. The fact that turnout has increased in smaller constituencies has been seen as a sign that this gambit worked. But in fact, there was no evidence that attempts to mobilize through direct electoral incentives, such as a new fire engine for the commune that has the highest turnout, had actually an effect on turnout overall. So there is more that we need to explain than simply this rather crude notion of a causal explanation. If we look at the distribution of support for the two main candidates from the perspective then not of geography but of sociodemographics, we see a familiar pattern, one that sort of those of you who have observed Polish politics for a number of years will recognize. There's greater support for Duda's voters among those who are of higher age cohorts. This contrasts with 2015, where Law and Justice was able to benefit from a somewhat higher than usual mobilization of younger voters, and where Duda himself was also able to benefit from that. But generally, this pattern has been part of the Polish political landscape and voting behavior landscape for a while, that generally Law and Justice tend to do better among older voters. They also tend to benefit from the fact that those older voters have a greater degree of electoral mobilization. They're more likely to turn out than their younger compatriots. Trzaskowski, on the other hand, has a very even age profile for his electorate, one which may help explain this time around why he didn't succeed in getting over the line, but which in some ways augurs more positively for his potential support in the future, given the fact that Law and Justice's supporters are generally aging. If we look at this from the perspective of domicile, it's no surprise to see that half of Duda's support came from those living in rural areas, and only 7% from large towns and cities, depending on how you make the distinction between large and medium size. Trzaskowski's electorate, again, was more urban in character, but was also this picture of a divide between an urban and a rural Poland isn't really borne out in these statistics. While there is a greater extent to which Duda gained support in rural areas, that doesn't mean that he wiped the floor with Trzaskowski in rural constituencies. There is still a significant amount of support for a non-peace candidate in smaller, more rural domiciles. So again, we have differences, but not divides. There is a somewhat starker divide when it comes to education. So these are statistics from the exit poll, but they do reflect fairly coherently and fairly faithfully what we observe in representative polls of the Polish voter, both at election time and in between elections. We can see that Duda's supporters are generally disproportionately from those with lower levels of education, whereas at least around half of Trzaskowski's voters have higher education. This isn't just a matter of educational attainment, though. It's also a matter of the changing patterns in the extent to which parts or age cohorts of the population obtain higher education or not. So partly this reflects the age differences between these two candidates' electorates. It's not purely a matter of educational attainment. If we look at occupational class, again taken from the exit poll, so there is a scope for some error here, but not to a huge extent. We can see that, again, a familiar pattern emerges. Duda is overrepresented, support for Duda is overrepresented among farmers, manual workers, the unemployed, and the retired. Whereas Trzaskowski has more support from business owners, managers, directors, and specialist professionals, and from students. Again, we can see other aspects mixed in here. Of course, students are more likely to be younger, and therefore this also reflects the age profile of Trzaskowski's electorate. But we can see that, again, there are differences without being hugely stark divides in most cases. We might say that among farmers, for example, the distinction is particularly stark. But in most cases, we see differences rather than insuperable divides. And there is still potential in a number of these occupational groups for those differences to move in another direction. The fact that Duda has been able to capture more votes among manual workers and among unemployed and retired people this time round does not necessarily mean that those groups are entirely faithful to a peace candidate. We can also see among administrative and service workers that there is a significant proportion of the population who are breaking evenly for both of the two candidates. Looking at this from the perspective of flows of voters, again, we see that a distinction which is a characteristic of the electorates of peace on the one hand and opposition parties on the other for a number of years, which is that generally peace voters and voters for peace candidates in presidential elections are more likely to remain loyal to their side. There is more scope for flows between candidates among candidates of the opposition. This is exaggerated in the sense that this is a two-horse race. So opposition supporters either have to decide whether they are going to cross over to support the representative of the currently governing party, or whether they're going to support an opposition candidate who may or may not be from their preferred party. But it still reflects a tendency for there to be greater loyalty among peace voters for their candidates. We can also see, if we look at this in terms of how it breaks down in terms of the percentage of those who voted in the first round, we see that the majority of Hołownia, Kosiniak-Kamysz's voters and Biedron's voters crossed over gave their votes to Trzaskowski in the second round. There were significant minorities, nevertheless, who did support Duda instead. And this is one of the reasons why it's likely that to help explain why Trzaskowski ultimately wasn't able to get over the line. He wasn't able to convince not only the voters of Krzysztof Bosak, who were sort of the hardest constituency for him to appeal to, but also some of those constituencies that we might have thought of being easier targets for him: Hołownia voters, Kosiniak-Kamysz voters, and in particular Biedron voters. A minority of each of those seems to have been unwilling to go for Trzaskowski, to an extent not necessarily predicted in polls in between the first and second rounds. We do need to say, where these data are concerned, and this goes for the socio-demographic data as well, that this is based on exit poll data, so there are going to be some differences. But given the accuracy of the exit poll, and in particular of the late poll, it's unlikely that these differences are going to be particularly substantial. In terms of flows of voters, then again, the greater degree of loyalty can be seen in the sense that peace voters were somewhat more likely to transfer their vote to Andrzej Duda than in the case of voters for opposition parties. Again, we have very much a divide between peace and a disaggregated opposition, which is struggling to find a single candidate around whom it can unify. If we look at it in terms of the 2015 presidential election, so where we have a a two-horse race, a second round runoff situation, which is more comparable directly to the election that we've just seen. Again, we can see a greater degree of loyalty among former Duda supporters. Partly this will be because of Komorowski's rather uninspiring campaign in 2015. Partly it will be because Duda is campaigning to be re-elected and has that recognition among his supporters in terms who are looking in terms for continuity of their representation. But to a large extent, this represents the greater loyalty of Law and Justice voters to their party and to their candidates in terms of their voting behavior. The last thing I wanted to look at is the issue of the diaspora vote. This was, even on the evening of the election, was seen as something that might be a factor that would swing the elections. There'd been a lot of attention paid to the fact that over 500,000 Poles had registered to vote in the second round, and despite the various problems of getting access to ballot papers under pandemic conditions, postal votes in some countries such as the UK, and the attendant problems where that was concerned. Nevertheless, there was a high turnout. So just over 400,000 votes were cast. This saw a significant break in favor of Trzaskowski, with just under 3/4 of diaspora voters opting for him in preference to Duda. If we look at how this breaks down at the level of individual nations, we can see that Duda still does better in those areas where the peace candidate, and in general the candidate further right, has tended to do better. So in the US in particular. But nevertheless, there was a notable decline in the extent to which the typically strongly supportive of Law and Justice diaspora in the US opted for Duda this time around. So ultimately, while Trzaskowski was able to make significant incursions into the diaspora vote to an extent that far exceeds what Komorowski was able to do in the 2015 election, ultimately it wasn't enough to swing the election for him. Even though the exit poll didn't include information about diaspora voting, it became clear when the late poll came in that the gap was just too great to be filled, that it would be impossible for the diaspora voters to swing the election for him. So overall then, from what we know so far, we can conclude, as I've emphasized throughout this presentation, that Poland is differentiated but not divided. This idea of a Poland A versus a Poland B, a Western versus Eastern Poland, reflects socio-demographic differences, reflects different historical experiences, reflects the specificity of regions, but it isn't determinate. It has an influence on the way in which different political currents are able to succeed in particular parts of Poland. But as Duda's performance nationwide has shown, this imaginary line between Poland A and Poland B is by no means impossible to cross. We could also conclude that the increase in turnout did to an extent help Duda more than Trzaskowski. It was suggested before the election that lower turnouts tend to favor Duda, or the peace candidates in general, because peace supporters tend to be more disciplined in terms of going to the polls. But in this case, we find that the increase in turnout, because it was slanted towards those parts of Poland and those areas of domicile where people are more likely to vote for Law and Justice and for their candidates, we can conclude that the increase in turnout was more helpful to Duda, in fact, than it was to Trzaskowski. Duda's electorate and Trzaskowski's electorate are divided in important ways, and in ways that can and will be consequential for the future of Polish politics. But again, this divide between an urban, young and well-educated electorate and a poorly educated, rural and older electorate is reflected in the differences between the electorates of these two main candidates, but at the same time is not a stark divide. There are reasons to believe that support can be gained by PiS among younger voters and better educated voters, and from on the side of the opposition, from among those parts of the political spectrum who tend in general to favour PiS. We could conclude then that PiS's electorate and the electorate for its candidates is loyal but is numerically limited, and we can suggest is potentially going to wane over the next few years, while the opposition's electorate is more fluid. That makes putting together winning coalitions for the opposition more difficult, but at the same time they can potentially benefit from that unpredictability and fluidity. The last thing to conclude on then is that the diaspora vote is potentially of significance when the stakes are, when the difference is as small as this. But at the same time, diaspora voters remain unpredictable in terms of whether they will turn out, to what extent they will turn out, and when they do so, who they will support. In 2015, the diaspora picture was very different in terms of turnout and in terms of preferred candidates and parties. So we can't conclude simply on the basis of this year's elections that the diaspora is a known political quantity. Mm-hmm. So those are the key conclusions that I would draw from what I've observed from the 3 or 4 days since the election occurred. So I'll move back to Wojciech now, and thanks for your attention.
Thanks. Also, thank you very much, Ben, for fantastic presentation. We can turn it off, and I'm turning off the recording for further discussion.